Good morning. Welcome to this special ASMOF guide to rights of private practice. We'll be looking at one of the major annual decisions that staff specialists need to make, their rights of private practice, or RoPP, RPP, level election, different terms in different places. So what does it matter? What should members be thinking about when they're thinking about making a rights of private practice election? With me today, my guests are Dr. Behny Samadi and Dr. Máté Rudas. Thanks for being here, guys. Thanks for helping our members understand the rights of private practice. Dr. Behny, we've spoken before about when you first started as a specialist. What was your experience with RoPP when you first started?
Thanks, Clancy. Thanks for having me here. So my experience was that I was told to start on level one, even though there was a group number one account. Everybody was on level three at the time, and then they asked me to bill on behalf of other consultants so they could get the ROP earnings, which I've learnt is quite a common practice, but not entirely kosher. And since then, I've done a lot of work through the union, obviously, and that's helped inform my understanding of the very deep rabbit hole that ROP goes down sometimes, and it can be complicated, but also I think it's good that we can simplify it for our members now. And I also did have done an MBA since then and understood the complexities of health funding structures and how ROP fits into that.
That would definitely assist. Thanks, Benny. Mate, I understand you've ended up as a bit of a local expert on rights of private practice.
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much for having me here today. Yes, so I had a very similar experience to Benny when I started out. I was told that this is how you elect your level. That's the level you're electing, and this is how you do your billing. And um, when I started asking questions, because I've always been, I'm obviously primarily medical, but I've always been interested in business and finance. And when I started asking questions, I realized that nobody actually understands how the system works. So I took it upon myself to try to dig into it a bit more and read whatever was out there and spent some time understanding the award. And then over time, I found myself explaining the award to some of my colleagues who've been doing it for 20 years and still don't have any idea about what the numbers or what the different levels actually mean to them. And yeah, I perpetually seem to be doing that year after year. So I think it's very important that you're having this discussion.
Thanks, Mate. Really appreciate it. And for my part, I've ended up with ASMOF in answering a lot of the rights of private practice questions that come through our industrial advice line. Uh, and that's, I guess I'm using some of those questions that we get here to put to you guys and get your opinions and your views on it and kind of take a pretty broad overview. Uh, First things first, I guess, what is rights of private practice level election? Benny?
So every financial year, staff specialists choose their ROP level, or they can choose to leave it the same and not change it. And that's effective from the 1st of July. So we're talking about the financial year here. The level determines how much your income comes from salary, which is a set and protected thing, and how much of it comes from what we call private practice billings. And what we mean there is revenue generated from the patients that elect to be treated privately. But the revenue actually comes mostly from Medicare. It can come from insurers or out-of-pocket expenses or DBA, for example. And then that also determines where your allowances come from, such as TESOL, and how much access you have to drawings and sort of discretionary spending. And once elected, the level is generally locked in for the whole financial year, and it can be altered by mutual agreement. But that's really more talking about a sort of a manual way to change it rather than just being effective from 1st of July.
So like a mid-cycle change to the rights of private practice level mid-year. What does mutual agreement mean in this context?
So mutual agreement really, as the name implies, means that the parties that make the agreement both have to agree. So neither you nor your employer can unilaterally change your level election. So both of you have to agree. And because of the implications in terms of your salary that your employer is paying and implications for your income, you both actually have to be in agreement and understand what that means. You're classically allowed to have that once during the course of the financial year, and you most of the time have to have pretty good reason for the change. I would suggest that any strategy that's based on you changing along the way if things don't work out is probably not the best strategy, and it's best to try to figure out what level you're going to be able to sustain for the whole of the financial year for you and for your employer to have to avoid any awkward conversations.
Behny, one of the biggest questions and most common questions we get from people who are unfamiliar with RoPP is, what is the best level to choose? Pretty simple question, right?
That's a great question, Clancy. And unfortunately, there is no one size fits all. There's no right answer for everyone. It's going to be entirely an individual decision and very specific to your circumstances, your work circumstances, and your personal circumstances. So some doctors prioritize having the bulk of their income coming from an employer-funded source, and that's stable and includes superannuation and the tax being taken off, but others would prefer to have more control over their income and have the capacity to generate more income. And again, that has sort of tax and super implications with that decision. So unfortunately, there's no universally correct answer.
Máté, anything you want to add to that one?
I think it's important to point out, without going, into too much detail, that because of the way the system is structured, doctors need to be aware that they're the ones really wearing the financial risk that goes with a level election. And what I mean by that is that if you have overestimated the billings and the private practice revenue that's supposed to fund your right of private practice drawings over the course of the year, then you can easily find yourself in a situation where you're actually worse off than you were before, or you have very little money going into the account that funds your education and TESOL and things like that. So it has to be a careful consideration.
Definitely. Can my department head or manager tell me what level to elect?
So the right of private practice election belongs to the individual staff specialist. Obviously your colleagues and head of department can give you advice, but ultimately you're the one that has to make the decision. Um, Probably the important exception to that is that if you're in a group setup, it is almost impossible to technically manage people on different levels in a group scenario. So in those instances, based on the information and data available, you as a group need to make an informed decision for the coming year in most circumstances.
Good to know. Thank you. When making a level election, I guess we've spoken about there are a lot of circumstances to think about, and it's all going to differ for different people. What's the most important factor to consider?
The most important factor to consider when you're electing your level of RoPP is what your realistic billing capacity is. And that's information that's absolutely crucial. You can't make a decision without it. And also whether we're talking about individual number one accounts or group number one accounts. You need to understand how much revenue you can generate, because that can vary enormously between different departments in the same hospital, between the same specialty in different hospitals. There are many factors that come into that, which are laid out in our RoPP fact sheet. However, you need an answer from the people who would know about what you can expect to bill in your particular department in that particular hospital. So if you work across different hospitals as well, it may change. If you work in more than one specialty, that's going to be different again. It's important to know because you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot, so to speak, by electing a higher level RoPP and then not being able to meet the requirements for billing to actually generate the revenue that you're expecting, generate the salary that you're expecting. And then you may actually end up being worse off than if you had stayed at a lower level.
So I understand you've looked at these numbers for yourself and some of your colleagues in terms of how much more you might need to build to change levels. Can you talk to us about those numbers at all?
Yeah, and I think it is a very important aspect of the right of private practice election, because most people, when they look at the requirements for going up a level, based off the published salary chart and right of private practice level election charts, what most people look at is the difference in earnings, and the difference in earnings may not look like a big step up. For example, if you look at the differences between level 2, level 3, or level 3, level 4, we're talking, roughly around $15,000, $20,000 thereabouts, depending on which year's publication you look at. But the important point there is that that is only a small fraction of the actual right of private practice billing increase that you require to go up a level, because the changes between levels are structured so that some of your fixed base income or the right of private practice or private practice allowance that the employer pays on top of that actually decreases. So you have to account for that and account for losses in superannuation and other things before you actually then get to increasing your level with the drawing. So put that in that was probably a bit of a convoluted way of saying it, but to put that into simplistic terms, you probably need about 3 times as much, private practice income than what your increase is going to be on a level. And if you want actual numbers, like I think as Behny said before, it does vary from institution to institution and even between specialties, between institutions, and your own agreements with your employer. But for me, being a staff specialist doing intensive care with a 20% facility fee, when I looked at the numbers for me to actually go up a level from level 1 to level 2, I think to be comfortable, and by comfortable I mean having enough money then rolling over to fund my number 2 account and my TESOL expenses, I would have needed somewhere in the vicinity of $150,000, and that would have been for about a roughly $40,000-$50,000 increase in my take-home salary, just to give you a ballpark figure. And I don't think the actual numbers are important, and I don't think people should go away thinking that these are the exact numbers that they need. But what people need to understand is that the billing requires for the changes in your level are much more significant than what the changes in your take-home pay packet will be. And that's, if you think about it, that's a way of sort of sharing the increased private practice revenue between your employer and yourself.
Thanks for that, Máté. I've got up your numbers here. I think that you did some time ago for it in terms of the billings required for the different levels. And yeah, you can see it's much bigger than you think. If you're just looking at that maximum possible drawings increase, the required billings are much higher. So in short, it is essentially your guaranteed base income is dropping with the private practice allowance reducing down to 0 at level 4, but your potential maximum incomes are increasing at that same time, but not at the same rate. Really, really important stuff to understand before making the change, I think, there. Behny and Máté, I think we've both spoken about, understanding your billing capacity in terms of making this sort of decision. How does one go about finding out what their billing capacity would be? As either a level 2 or 3 that might not have looked at it that much, or even as a level 1?
I think that information should be available to all clinicians, and whether that's your head of department or an oversight committee or your right of private practice manager at your local health district or somebody at district finance, somebody should be able to provide you that information. I would suggest that if you don't know where to turn, then your head of department should definitely be able to point you in the right direction. But this should be freely available information. And look, if I was looking at changing level election, what I would be looking at is not just current numbers, but probably averages and trends over the last couple of years. I would try to factor in whether there are any planned changes of service provision and, my working patterns. But, if you want to find out what your current billings are and your historical billings have been as a starting point for the last few years, then yeah, there should be a person in the hospital or in your local health district who could give you very exact figures on that.
That's a really good point, Mate, because I started in a new department during COVID, and the information I was given about realistic billing capacity was actually wrong because COVID brought, as we all know, a lot of the billing to a halt. And in retrospect, I probably would have been better off electing level 1, at least for the first year, rather than the level that I did elect, and ended up with no TESOL at the end of that financial year. So I think it's really important to understand trends and circumstances and changes in billing practices that are happening within the time frame.
Really important points, and takes us to a great question as well, which is how does TESOL funding fit into the decision about right to private practice?
Well, TESOL's quite an interesting one. Level 1 is funded differently to levels 2 to 5. Level 1 has TESOL funded directly by the local health district or public health organisation. Importantly, for level 1 specialists, that the money for their TESOL isn't quarantined in any kind of way. So that actually provides a bit of a disincentive for the district to fund TESOL. They don't get any extra funding or anything. They just have to work it out with the existing budget. For level 2 to 5s, it's entirely different. It's self-funded essentially, in that your whatever you've received into the number 1 account throughout the financial year, at the end of the financial year, anything remaining in there after your drawings have been paid out from month to month rolls over into the number 2 account. So that has a few important factors to consider. One, you don't get any TESOL funding until the end of the financial year. That's important. The caveat there is if you have a group number 2 account, there will be funds in there already. So that won't be a problem for people with a group number 2 account. But if you have an individual number 2 account, it might be the case that you don't get any TESOL until the next financial year. So you have to wait a whole period of time.
Mm.
And of course, that's going to factor into what level you elect, because you can determine, you can use a RoPP calculator on our website, or you can try and do the maths, how much TESOL you will actually have, because you're not going to be automatically guaranteed the currently it's about $40,000. It's going to be entirely dependent on how much money rolls into your number 2 account. So if you only get let's say $5,000 or $10,000 left in your number 1 account at the end of the financial year, well, that's just tough luck. That's all you get for your TESOL for the entire next financial year. It doesn't get topped up in any way or anything like that. Similarly, you can choose to have even more than 40,000 rolling over into your number 2 account, and you can use those funds. There are some limitations and over what you're allowed to spend that on, but there's essentially a lot of discretion in terms of using the accounts in your number 2.
It's a much broader range of things you can spend the number 2 account funds on than just TESOL for the level 1s, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. You can the number 2 accounts, essentially most of the rules will make it so that the expenses that you're allowed to spend the money on are essentially offsetting the costs to the public health organization. If you want to be a bit skeptical.
Mutually beneficial, I think, is the term that the New South Wales Health prefers. Okay, look, that's a really good point. Can we talk a bit more about number 1 and number 2 accounts? What are they?
The a question that often comes up, and essentially their number 1 account is a hospital controlled account where they have sub ledgers. for either individuals or groups, whether you've got an individual or a group setup. And the number one account, if you want to think about it that way, that's the easiest way probably to look at it, is what holds all of your private practice revenue, either for yourself or for your group. So that is all the billings, all the medical billings that that are getting charged to any private patient, any DVA patient, insurance patient, or even, you know, if you've got self-funded private patients in the public institution. So any of that revenue actually goes into that account. And then there are very specific expenses that come out of that account during the course of the financial year. One is a facility fee, which, as we've talked about it, can change from specialty to specialty or facility from facility. As I said, in my case, that's 20%, which goes to the institution. And the other big chunk of money that comes out of it is your RPP drawings on a monthly basis that get paid to you. There is one other group of expenses that can come out of the number one account, which is essentially a small amount of money that can go towards accounting fees of managing that account, and as a discretionary expense at the usually at the end of financial year, you're allowed to pay or not pay your indemnity out of that, or get your indemnity reimbursed. And after those expenses have all come out, whatever is left in the number one account gets rolled over into the number two account. And similarly, you can have an individual or a group number two account, and that gets used to pay for the, on level 2 to 5, that gets used up to pay for your expenses that fall under TESOL, plus any other allowed expenses that you can fund from the number two account.
Indeed. And I think the three of us probably understand that the actual mechanisms of the money moving around between the number ones and number twos are quite complex. There's a lot of movements around accounting for GST costs and credits going back and forth. But the number two account is for TESOL, as we've spoken about, or TESOL equivalencies. How does it work? What's the comparison?
Well, it's similar, but there are some differences to be aware of. So all staff specialists have access to TESOL leave, and then there's TESOL funding. So when we talk about TESOL, there's two aspects. The TESOL leave really just accumulates indefinitely, and most staff specialists will have more than they need. It's about 5 weeks, 5 calendar weeks per year. In terms of the funding source, that's, as we've mentioned, where the main differences come in between level 1 and level 2 to 5. An important caveat to remember is that you can accumulate TESOL. What we commonly say is for 2 years, but technically you can accumulate TESOL up to a dollar value equivalent to 2 years worth of a full-time staff specialist salaries entitlement. So currently at the moment, the entitlement is about $40,000 annually for one FTE. So every staff specialist, regardless of their FTE, can accumulate up to $80,000. It is very much a use it or lose it situation, because if you don't use it, you lose it. It gets wiped. It goes into the ether. So please make sure that you do use it. And that data is actually tracked by Ministry of Health, and that's data that we can use to argue for your rights and say how much TESOL you need and have to have. So we would encourage all staff specialists to use their full entitlement.
Great point. So the level ones, maximum of 2 times the 1 year entitlement. Does the number two account have a maximum?
So the number two account itself has no maximum. That you just roll over whatever's left in your number one account at the end of the financial year. And those number two accounts, particularly in some group accounts, can accumulate to millions of dollars. And those funds are used to purchase very expensive equipment, for example, or employ people. There are many uses for that money. However, the TESOL component comes out of the number two account. It's important to remember that even though for level ones there is a cap on how much TESOL they can have annually. That cap is more of a guideline for level 2 to 5. It's not a rule. So how much TESOL you actually get, or how much money from the number 2 account you actually get to spend on TESOL, is determined usually by a different mechanism. So in many hospitals, they will have an oversight committee, for example, that will allocate TESOL funding for each staff specialist. And in other hospitals, it may be a different mechanism. So it may be controlled by your head of department or other individuals.
It varies, basically.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What about superannuation? That's another part of people's salary and income that's fairly important for them.
Yeah, so superannuation is an important aspect, I guess, that that people often don't consider, and that's not very, I guess, transparent when you look at the difference in level election. Because superannuation only gets paid on your salary, your special allowance, and your private practice allowance, so all of the money that comes from your employer. But importantly, superannuation is not paid on your right of private practice drawings. And as we discussed during the earlier questions, as you go up a level, less of your income is coming from your employer, so your private practice allowance will decrease. If you go up to level 5, then even your base salary will decrease, and more of your money is coming from right of private practice drawings. So when you do the maths, if you really want to do due diligence, then the changes in your superannuation also need to be factored in, because often what you will find is if you're on a marginal call in terms of whether you can go up a level or not, if you factor in that you're going to get less super by the time you get there, you may not even be better off at all. So I think that needs to be a part of the consideration, and I think people need to actively look at whether they're going to get how much less super they would get on going up a level, and what that actually means for them.
Great advice. Great advice. And I think the ASMOF rights of private practice calculator can help people kind of see that and visualize it a bit more easily, but it is one to look at quite carefully because it can be subtle changes. What about tax implications? Everyone's favorite time of year at the moment.
So your PAYG tax that is deducted out of the employer contribution of your salary as normal, and the associated allowances like the private practice allowance and the 17.4% staff specialist allowance, which are all components of your salary. But RoPP drawings do not have tax withheld. So that's an important consideration, because you can get a bit of a shock at tax time. And what you should be doing is filing a BAS, or business activity statement, every quarter as well, if you have RoPP, if you're on RoPP level 2 to 5. And that's because as you go up levels, that discrepancy becomes even greater, because, as we've discussed, a bigger portion of your income is coming from private practice rather than employer salary.
Would you recommend contacting an accountant or a financial planner if you're looking at moving to a rights of private practice arrangement?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think some of the rules and regulations around managing that income, and in particular managing GST implications in the right of private practice settings are very, very complicated. And I think you do need to find an accountant who's well versed in looking after medical specialists in your own state. I think that will be a very beneficial thing to do.
So not just any accountant that you can find on the street down at the town square. You think a specialized one?
I would definitely recommend finding both an accountant and a financial advisor who can advise you about superannuation and the tax implications, that has experience with medical professionals, because our revenue streams can be quite complicated and quite confusing. There are a few ways that you can find somebody who might have the requisite experience. So you can ask your colleagues who they use. You can also, often colleges might be have member benefits, and same with medical indemnity. They have member benefits, and that one of those benefits will include a recommendation of an accounting or financial planner or whatever you want to call it, who because they are partnered with the college or medical indemnity has had experience in that area because I've had previous clients. In my experience, I've found that they didn't require extensive, tedious explanation of the many different kinds of revenue streams that we can generate as doctors, and they understood RoPP, they understood salary, and they understood sort of outside practice revenue as well. So those are some ways that you can find somebody who can help you out. And as Mate's mentioned, it's very important to have proper advice around this because we're talking about significant sums of money now and tax implications and superannuation implications.
Would that be a good question, I guess, when you're trialing or looking at an accountant is, do you know what rights of private practice is? Could be an easy test for it if they understand it, potentially.
Yeah, yeah, potentially. Ideally, you could just show them your statement, which we get monthly, and they should be able to, you shouldn't need to explain it to them. They should
Great.
be able to figure out what your income is, and what needs to be declared, for example, for tax purposes.
Going back to group accounts versus individual accounts, what are the differences? Are there benefits to being a group account versus a solo account?
Yeah, so it's an important question, and often people are presented with an existing setup when you join a new workplace, and usually there are good reasons why people have group accounts. And group accounts, just to recap quickly, work by pooling all of the private practice income from all of the specialists that are in the group account into that account, and that account then pays for the individual's right of private practice drawings and all the other things that come out of the number one account, and then any rollover goes into usually also group number two account in that scenario. And the most obvious benefit of having an account like that would be in clinical setups where your predicted private practice revenue has fluctuations. And again, I can mention intensive care as my own specialty as a good example where depending on how our rostering is, and often, especially in larger facilities, a lot of the roles that we perform are not necessarily, quote unquote, revenue generating roles. So if we're providing outside assistance, met calls, clinical assist, if we're covering after hours, if we're doing retrievals, all of those things don't necessarily involve us looking after a pot of patients. So the right of private practice income that's going to be generated in these roles is very small. So depending on how your rostering works, your actual income over the financial year, although it may balance out between the individuals from month to month or week to week, it will change quite significantly. And I think in those scenarios, having a group account alleviates some of those problems. And if you think of it from a manager's perspective, it is very difficult if you have individual accounts, it's very difficult to balance a complicated roster in a way where everybody feels, financially not disadvantaged. So I think you want to create an environment where nobody needs to worry about having to work the school holidays because none of the surgeons are operating, or having to work periods where the surgical activity is low. I think it has its benefits. It also comes with having to be in a group and work with a group. So, you need to have some working relationships, obviously, with the others in your group to make sure that the decisions you make cohesively. But I think overall it's a good setup to cater for those specialties and those rostering scenarios where you do have big fluctuations.
Thanks for that, and really great stuff about the rostering considerations. I hadn't looked at it in that way before, but really important to understand that. What happens if I resign, retire, or move districts? What happens with my accounts?
So there's a couple of things to consider. First, if you're resigning or retiring, your leave payouts are calculated using your average remuneration over the previous 3 years. So changing levels can affect future leave payouts. It's important to remember that it's always better to actually take your leave rather than get it paid out, because your RoPP, your RoP drawings don't get paid out. There's nothing to pay. What they're paying out is the employer funded part of your salary. The second thing to consider, particularly if you're moving districts, and that's to do with your number 2 account. So those funds don't move with you, unfortunately. If you leave the district, the funds in your number 2 account will go, if it's an individual account, will go into the hospital's general fund. You don't get to take it with you. That's important to note because you don't want to land in a new place and realize you have absolutely no TESOL, because you don't have, your number 2 account balance is zero, starting at zero. If you have a group account and you leave the district, that money stays in the group account. Again, you don't get to take it with you, but it doesn't go to the hospital general fund. So those are important considerations, and it's mostly to do with TESOL and your number 2 account balance.
Really important point you're making about the leaving and looking at right to private practice. There's a requirement that expenditure is mutually beneficial for the public health organisation and the staff members we've spoken about. In practical terms, when people are looking at retiring, this means that once notice is given of an intention to retire at a certain date, the hospital's not going to get benefit out of you going to that conference anymore. And by and large, conference applications will be refused, even if you've got plenty of money in your accounts. So we'd strongly suggest, if you're planning towards retirement, don't talk about the actual plan to retire at a specific time until you've taken those conferences that you want to take, or at the very least got them booked and locked in. But it'd be our preference that you actually take them before you give notice. But have a chat to ASMOF if you've got any questions about that. Before making a decision on a rights of private practice level, like a change or even moving to levels 2 to 5 for the first time, what practical steps should members take before doing that?
Okay, so there's probably 4 steps. There's 4 things to consider. The first thing is understanding how much billing comes in. And that's looking at your number 1 account billing data. That's what you want to ask for, is number 1 account billing data. And that, as we've mentioned, can be, you can get that information from various sources, but you need to understand what your revenue generating ability is. That's the first thing. The second thing is TESOL in your number 2 account. How much money do you want in your number 2 account? How much money do you want for TESOL, for professional development, etc., and other expenses? You can use your number 2 account, and then you can use a RoPP calculator, or you can do the math to figure out how much revenue you need to generate, how much you want in your number 2 account, and therefore what level election you can comfortably elect. The third consideration is talking to your colleagues, not just to inform the first 2 points I mentioned, but also to understand that in a group account, logistically, you probably all need to elect the same level. So that's an important consideration. And whether you go into group accounts versus individual accounts is also another consideration. So you do need to understand the dynamics of your department and what's currently happening there. And finally, as we've mentioned, we would strongly recommend you speak to an accountant or financial advisor. No one here is an accountant. It's important to understand that there are limitations to the advice that we can give you, and you would be far better off speaking to an experienced professional in this area, both in terms of understanding tax implications and also superannuation, and also more general financial advice given the sums of money that we're talking about.
Thanks, Behny. We're getting to the end here. I guess I'd ask you both to have a think about what's the key takeaway. If someone's coming, I've watched this or skimming through this video, what's the key takeaway about RoPP that you'd like them to go away with?
Yeah, so I think the most important takeaway, if you're going to take one thing away from this, is that simply choosing the highest level available to you is not necessarily the right decision for you. And I think you have to have a very clear and very concise understanding of your projected billing capacity and how much money you actually have to work with. And then in light of that, have a look at the variations between your projected superannuation and income and the TESOL that goes with that, or the TESOL, that money that you have in number two account left over after those things on various levels. And you then need to look at that in the context of your own financial goals, your taxation implications, and where you are really with your career and what your priorities are. So there isn't really a one size fits all. I think you need to have a very good understanding of what the possibilities are, and even within those possibilities, what works best for you.
Thanks for that. Behny, anything you want to add?
Nope.
So I think Máté's really covered it there really
Yeah,
well.
I think
It is,
yeah, that's
and I
it.
think you guys have really outlined it quite clearly. This is a really individual decision in a lot of ways, and it's not a simple one. But if you follow the kind of steps that you've just laid out there, Behny, in terms of understanding and having an understanding of what your billing capacity is, you can make an informed decision, and it might be you might be surprised about your capacity, or you might realize that you're shortchanging yourself. But it's worthwhile looking at it each year, I think, and really considering it in the lead up to July, about what is best for you in your circumstances at the moment. I think that is probably all we have time for today. I'd really thank you so much, Behny, Máté, for your time. And thanks to our members who are going to be watching this and hopefully going out and making better choices about their rights of private practice. We really hope this discussion has given you a clearer understanding of RoPP, level election processes, and the factors that might influence your decision. Hopefully, you've got enough information now to make that sort of decision. But if you need more information, or if you have questions about your options, please feel free to contact ASMOF New South Wales. Easiest way is just via our website, where if you log in under the member resources section, you'll also find our new RoPP comparison tool, where you can put in your individual data into it, and including your estimated billings, your various levels, your MDO costs, that sort of stuff, and it will spit out calculations as to what your estimated personal income and number two account benefits, things like that, might be in quite a lot of detail. So it's worthwhile, if you are thinking about making a change, or even if you just haven't looked at your own in a while, go in there, use the tool, have a look at it, and if something comes up or you have any questions, reach out to us, and we're happy to help. Thanks again, Behny. Thanks, Máté, and we'll see you next time.